From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Trump signs a memo promising reciprocal tariffs on U.S. trading partners, but with no immediate action, markets sense a reprieve. Meantime, Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, effort continues forward under new criticisms of a constitutional crisis. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. After holding off recently on threatened 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, President Trump is now also delaying his long-promised reciprocal tariffs. The memo that he signed this week says this: the United States has one of the most open economies and has among the lowest average weighted tariff rates in the world. The United States imposes fewer barriers to imports than other major world economies. But it says that for many years, the United States has been treated unfairly by trading partners, both friend and foe. But the key point of this memorandum is it directs the Commerce Secretary and the United States Trade Representative to investigate harm to the United States from non-reciprocal trading arrangements and then to submit a report detailing proposed remedies. Here's Donald Trump in the Oval Office on Thursday explaining why reciprocal tariffs may not help lower prices, at least in the short term.
Are prices going to go up short-term,
well,
long-term?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily, but I'll tell you what will go up is jobs. The jobs will go up tremendously. We're going to have great jobs for everybody. This is something that should have been done many years ago. China did it. China did it at a level that probably nobody's ever seen before. If you manufactured a car, you couldn't send it into China. The tariff was so high. So everybody went and they built in China. It was no big secret. So we're going to see, but it's going to mean tremendous amounts of jobs. And ultimately, prices will stay the same, go down. But we're going to have a very dynamic country.
Alicia, what do you make of this investigation of these quote-unquote non-reciprocal trading arrangements, and then particularly the delay here? President Trump has imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum, but has held off so far on Canada and Mexico, and now these reciprocal tariffs. And I'm starting to wonder whether he has been spooked a little bit by the market and economic reaction to those threats.
Well, I think that's right. You might also say the cooler heads prevailed on this one, that those in his administration, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, who've been trying to get him to walk back from the cliff, so to speak. It's not really clear what he's aiming to get at with these reciprocal tariffs. Is he using them as bargaining chip to get other countries to lower their tariff or other trade barriers, or if he is trying to actually protect the U.S. industry, meaning to force companies to make more goods in the U.S. by raising U.S. tariffs to the level of foreign countries. It may be a bit of both, but what he did was provide a period of study directing his Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, and his U.S. Trade Representative to study whether and how to match the tariff rates of foreign countries, and also include their non-tariff trade barriers, such as he claims, the value-added taxes in Europe. I wouldn't say that those actually discriminate against U.S. companies, but other things like subsidies for domestic companies, barriers to genetically modified GMO foods that keep out U.S. farm products out of Europe. There are other kinds of non-tariff barriers that other countries use to hurt U.S. companies. Again, I guess I'll throw out another digital regulation that harms U.S. companies and makes it harder for them to compete in Europe. And there are various ways that countries can discriminate against U.S. companies, and they do, though I'm not sure that threatening to impose reciprocal tariffs will actually achieve much other than fast-tracking a trade war, which will end up hurting U.S. workers, U.S. businesses, and consumers more than anyone else.
Kim, what do you make of the idea in the abstract, the general, of reciprocal tariffs? I think in the political arena, that might be a popular idea. There is a certain basic argument, you tariff me, I tariff you. do, tit for tat. But there's an interesting op-ed in the Journal today by the economist Doug Irwin under the headline, Reciprocal Tariffs Make No Sense. And part of the argument is the classical economics argument that if one country has a bad tariff policy and is making it more expensive for its consumers to buy food from the U.S., let's say, then that doesn't necessarily mean that it is smart policy for the U.S. to follow that, to export its own tariff policy and follow the leader there and make it more expensive for U.S. consumers to buy food that is exported by that country. But there are also some interesting practical questions that are being raised in this op-ed. One of them is, what about situations where U.S. tariffs are actually higher than the tariffs of people who are exporting things to the United States? When Trump talks about reciprocal tariffs, does he mean that we are going to lower our tariff rates in those kind of situations? And then what about situations where trade for a given good or category of goods is one way? The op-ed uses the example of rare earth minerals. China exports rare earth minerals to the United States. The U.S. does not export rare earth minerals to China. So what does reciprocal trade in that sort of situation mean? And you could make up other examples. The U.S. buys a lot of avocados from Mexico. I can't imagine that Mexico is importing avocados from the United States. And so what is the level of analysis here? Does reciprocal trade mean that we are going to balance our avocado imports versus our exports of some other kind of food on the broader category of food? And maybe those are the kinds of questions that are going to be answered by this investigation by the Commerce Secretary and the U.S. Trade Representative. But Kim, those answers are not self-evident, at least to me.
Right. Look, I will say this, just stepping back for a second. If you're looking for silver linings here, the argument of reciprocal trade tariffs is probably at least slightly better than across-the-board tariffs that are willy-nilly, that just get applied to every product from every country, no matter what. So at least there's now going to be some level of analysis here and distinction. And as our editorial pointed out, there's been a reprieve of at least a couple of months while this report is put out. If you talk to the Trump people, their argument for why to do this is, well, in a perfect world, you put these tariffs on or threaten them, and it encourages other countries to take their tariffs off, and somehow this results in freer trade. I would love that if that is indeed what happens, although I think it's highly unlikely because of the complexity that you just mentioned. Because in the end, this isn't necessarily tit for tat. Trade markets are vastly complicated, and the number of unexpected or unforeseen consequences of going down this road, I think, are things that really bear teasing out. As you just mentioned, a couple of them, I would mention a follow-on one to that. If you have a country that doesn't levy any tariffs on us, and we decide as a result under reciprocal tariffs, if you were really going to be straightforward about it, that we are now going to dismantle our tariffs on them. Are our U.S. industries really ready for that level of competition, right? I don't see Donald Trump rushing to say to U.S. sugar producers, hey, we can't wait to throw open this market to the rest of the world, especially because that is one of the biggest lobbies in the United States that gets some of the biggest protection ever. And so you have to play this out. The other thing that I find very weird about this is what gets lost is what really seems to bug Donald Trump. It's simply the notion that we have trade deficits with some countries. And that's really what gets him rolling on this. But that really misstates the whole point of trade. Certain countries have competitive advantages in certain areas that we don't. And under the whole idea of trade is you buy things from them because they can do it more cheaply or they have a better ability to do it. You mentioned China and rare earth minerals. We're not really producing those in the United States. We might have some options to, but we haven't been willing to do the mining and do the work to get it. So when it comes to that, yes, that's going to be on China's favor in terms of a trade balance. And mean, if you just were to imagine a straight up like scenario where you had one country that made something that we can't produce and they get something from us that they can't produce, unless you have like some agreement where you're going to spend exactly the same money on that product, even regardless of needs, there's always going to be a trade deficit. So looking at that in an abstract is really just not a very accurate way of looking as to whether or not trade is beneficial to the United States.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back. The other piece of this argument that I found fascinating from economist Doug Irwin is the idea that it does not seem like government efficiency to have a federal bureaucracy that is trying to balance trade in all sorts of individual goods and categories. Here's a line from the op-ed. It says a reciprocal policy would enormously complicate the U.S. tariff system. The harmonized tariff schedule of the United States, which details individual rates on particular commodities, has about 13,000 line items. And the gist of this, Alicia, is that if the bureaucracy then is going to try to individually adjust each of those 13,000 line items for 200 or so countries that the United States trades with, you end up with a bureaucracy that is trying to manage something like 2.5 million tariff rates. And the complexity, I think, is worth diving into a little bit because it is hard to grasp unless you go look some of this stuff up. So I started poking around the harmonized tariff schedule of the United States. Here's a fun chapter on musical instruments, chapter 92. So it says pianos are subject to a general tariff rate of 4.7%. Other musical string instruments played with a bow, 3.2%, except guitars. Those are 4.5%. Brass wind instruments, 2.9%. Mouth organs, free. Bagpipes, free. And it goes on and on like this for thousands, literally thousands of pages. Chapter 66, sun umbrellas, walking sticks, sea sticks, whips, riding crops, and parts thereof. Chapter 67, prepared feathers and down and articles made of feathers or of down. And Alicia, the more time this afternoon that I have spent reading through this harmonized tariff schedule, the more that I have wondered, why don't we just doge this entire thing and stop having a bureaucracy where people go to work every day and they argue about which of these tariff categories some sort of product comes in because there's a 2% difference in the general tariff that gets levied.
Right. And these are actually the most favored nations. So the U.S. essentially, for those countries with which we do not have free trade agreements, we impose the same duty across the board for all other countries. And that's basically the modern trade system. Now, the reciprocal trade tariffs that Mr. Trump is now pondering would essentially do away with that. But to your point about the complexity, you're exactly right. There are different kinds of cinnamons it distinguishes. And why is government getting involved in this is a bigger question. You've mentioned Doge. This is exactly the opposite of what Doge is trying to accomplish and trying to shrink the bureaucracy, providing fewer opportunities for lobbying. This is just a lobbyist stream because they're going to seek all kinds of different carve-outs. I mean, string instruments. Well, maybe our guitar really isn't a guitar. It's a different kind of string instrument. And that's the kind of stuff you'll probably see. And we've already seen lobbying for exemptions from Trump's 25% steel and aluminum tariffs that he announced. The automakers are looking for that. The oil and gas industries are. There was a lot of lobbying during Trump's first term for exemptions from the Chinese Section 301 tariffs. Apple did, for instance, for its iPhones that it was importing from China. You also had lobbying, and there was a number of exemptions for his first term steel and aluminum tariffs. And just as a market perspective, this just creates deadweight loss. I mean, inefficiencies and misallocations of capital, as you have people or companies basically seeking to take advantage of carve-outs or create carve-outs. It could hurt the global trading system, at large.